So, welcome along to Sega Does episode 49. We're just about to crack the 50 mark, and what a way to preliminarily do that with a talk about the Sega Game Gear. Yes, I can't believe it. We've finally got some new hardware. Who is here to discuss the new hardware with me? It is the man who likes revising himself every 3 or 4 years, just like Sega did. It is Dylan Cornelius. How are we doing?
I'm good. So I've got my gear-to-gear cable with me, so you and I can play Game Gear games together, and then I've got the battery pack, so
I was going to say,
our
we'll play for like
batteries
4
don't die.
minutes. And
Yeah. And then I've got the TV tuner, so we can watch some old school tube TV.
Nice.
Yeah, I am giving all my money to Sega. So
why not?
I'm very excited to talk about the Game Gear today, as you can tell.
The epitome of capitalism, that is the Game Gear. Right. Let's talk about the Game Gear. What is the Game Gear? The Game Gear is Sega's first and last? No, not last, actually.
Not
first
last. Yeah.
handheld console.
Woohoo!
Woo! Now, handheld consoles in the late 80s / early 90s, there is one name, and we don't like doing it too much here, but actually we kind of do. Talking about Nintendo, we are now here, guys. There's one name you cannot mention when you talk about the Game Gear without talking about its part namesake. They couldn't even come up with like a wholly original name for this thing. We're talking about the Game Boy to start off. Now, what is the Game Boy? The Game Boy was the brainchild of Nintendo. It's like, well, people like to play games. We've established that with the NES. Maybe they'd like to play games as they wander around and sit on planes and, don't have phones to look at. So Nintendo obviously created the Game Boy, and it was an unbelievable smash success. There really was nothing quite as big as the Game Boy when it came out. It was the epitome of right place, right time, but also relevant to our conversation that we're going to talk about in a minute, right hardware type. It's very important.
Yep.
So what did the Game Boy do well? What the Game Boy did well is it played games rather well with a decent control setup. It played games for a long time because the batteries lasted a long time. It was cheap because it was not an expensive piece of hardware when it came out. It wasn't cheap, and it stayed cheap forever. And what also did it do? The big difference is going to be the screen is what we're going to talk about. Now, Game Boy, for its time, was a good screen in a portable device, because screens in portable devices were not things at all.
It's true.
The most portable display you ever had in your house was when your dad wanted to take the TV outside for some reason and stuck an extension cable. He just wanted to sit with his feet in the pool and watch the game. One day.
Mm-hmm.
That was about as portable as displays got in the 80s and 90s, until the Game Boy came along, which gave you a little dot matrix screen that was not backlit, wasn't even really black and white. It was like grr and white. It was and it had 4 colours. Well, colours.
4 colours.
In 4 shades is probably a better way to describe it. Very much shades of grey. Haha, very funny. But it worked. People loved it. It was cheap. It worked well. Dylan alluded to some various communication cables. You could play it with friends by linking them together, so it wasn't a purely singular experience either. The Game Boy just worked, and as we are a Sega centric podcast, Sega they didn't copy Nintendo from the gate, but it wasn't long until they were basically stealing everything in sight from Nintendo. It didn't take very long, and they wanted a bit of this portable game pie, and they came up with the Game Gear. Now, Dylan, before we talk about technical aspects of Game Gear, did you back in the day have much experience with a Game Gear?
I did, as a matter of fact.
Ooh.
For not being a Sega kid, I have a surprising amount of history with the Game Gear, because my cousin growing up, who lived I mean, we lived pretty close to each other. He got a Game Gear. He saved up his money, got a Game Gear. He got the battery pack.
Oh wow.
He invested in this thing, and he also had a Game Boy. So I guess he was just kind of more of a portable guy.
Was he one of those kids like that had everything, or was this like his thing?
No, that's the thing. He didn't have everything.
Okay.
I had the Nintendo stuff. He didn't have the Nintendo stuff. Well, except Game Boy, I guess.
Everybody had a Game Boy, didn't they?
Yeah,
had a Game Boy.
Right, exactly. So yeah, so he had the games you would expect, basically the Sonic games, and I think he probably had one of those Disney ports, like the Lion King or something. He had a couple other non-Sonic games that I can't remember, but I remember thinking the Game Gear is a great handheld, and this is 93, 94 as a kid, so I'm like 8 or 9, and I remember thinking the Game Gear is a great handheld, except the battery's life sucks so bad. It is just garbage. And so just keeping that in mind, everything Sam listed about the Game Boy is, I don't want to say it's the complete opposite with the Game. The Game Gear has color, and it doesn't just have some color. It has a lot of colors. It has 4,096 possible colors. That's a lot for a handheld. And when you consider the Game Boy has 4 shades of gray green, that's just a lot. But you paid for it. It was a more expensive handheld. And then you paid for it in battery life. If you actually wanted to play through any game, the battery pack was essential. You just had to have it. And but in terms of the screen, in terms of how it felt in your hands, I thought it felt really nice. It's kind of heavy, but it's not...
It's full of batteries.
It's full of batteries. It's not as handheldy as the Game Boy.
No.
The Game Boy, you could shove in your back pocket, in theory. It'd be a bulky back pocket, but you could do it. The Game Gear
I had cargo pants
like
in the 90s. That's fine.
Right. The Game Gear is kind of like the Switch. It is a handheld, but there's some finagling you gotta do to bring it with you, right? You can't just... Well, you could just bring your original Switch, not the Switch Lite. If you bring in the original Switch, it's like, well, I don't want the screen to scuff, so I got to get a case, and I don't know. It's just it's a process. It's a process.
Yeah.
So
whereas Game Boy, you didn't care. You just throw it in the back seat of the car and not bother about it. The Game Gear was like,
exactly.
No, this is expensive and it's big and it could possibly break, which they did a lot. And
yes.
You wanted to protect your investment. That's a good way of looking at it. The Game Gear was much more considered a system, and the Game Boy was definitely more of a, I would say, throwaway thing, but it was a more consumable product. Right.
The Game Boy, or the Game Gear, was a premier handheld, if you will.
It was the Vita.
Kind of like the Lynx, if anybody remembers the Lynx. But so that's my history with it. What about you? What are your?
I have very little history of it. I have one memory where I was. Now this is a memory held by a lot of people, I do believe. I had my Sega friend, and his older brother had a Game Gear, and he let me have a go on it once, and I spent 20 minutes or so hunched over in a corner with the AC adapter plugged in, crouched on the floor playing a Game Gear. I can remember doing that. I can't exactly remember the game I was playing. Couldn't have been that entertaining. But yeah, I played. My Game Gear experience was, like a lot of people, plugged into a wall socket, which isn't exactly portable.
Right. Yep.
Yes, which is a problem. So, what was crammed into the Game Gear? Well, I push back on the notion which a lot of people have, which is it's basically a Master System in your hand. That was the, from what I've gathered, that is basically how people describe this thing. Now, so let's get a little bit techie here. Okay, so the Master System had a Zilog Z80 processor. Oh, it's a Motorola? I can't remember exactly. Anyway, a Z80 8-bit processor running at 3.8 3.58 megahertz with 8 kilobits of RAM and 16 kilobits of VRAM. Okay, they were the tech specs. It also had a dedicated sound processor as well, which is very important to remember. Now the Game Gear had the same Z80 processor running at the same speed, and it also had 8 kilobits of RAM and 16 kilobits of VRAM, and it did have a slightly different sound processor as well. But the main difference was the resolution that this thing ran at. Now the Mark III ran at like standard NES resolutions, and I think it did have a slightly higher res mode, which was like around 240 by something. But obviously, the Game Gear is restricted because there's only one screen the Game Gear uses, and that is the Game Gear screen. And that is a screen of 160 by 144 pixels. Now, the problem with that being is a lot of the games that got released for the Game Gear were Master System ports in inverted commas. Now, the problem was you couldn't straight port them because the resolutions didn't match at all. So what you got a lot of on Game Gear is like watching a widescreen movie through a toilet roll. You're kind of looking like through your hands at the screen, and you can see the middle bit of the screen, and then they cram all the UI in around the edges. But that's all you're gonna get is that little bit, and they were basically compact, like as in a viewing window sort of thing. They were like shrunken down versions of Master System games, and that's basically what you got on the Master System. Did they play okay? Well, that's debatable, and we're going to discover that over the next, I don't know, 2 or 3 years. But yeah, it kind of was a Master System in your hand, but then the resolution goes and lets it down.
Yeah, I think where they improve though is in the color, in the color.
Yes, yeah.
Palette.
I think it did technically have more colours. Game Gear could do just over 4,000 colours.
Right.
And I haven't got Master System colours here, but I don't think it was 4,000.
Well, according to my article, which may or may not be wrong, so I'll just admit that, but apparently the Master System had 64 colors.
64 colours? Oh, well, then there you go. There's a lot more colours going on there.
So I think maybe that makes up for it a bit. I'm not as techie as you or as many others, so I might be.
The problem I have with Game Gear games is like Sonic is a very good example. Now, Sonic was a very prolific Game Gear game. Obviously, we haven't got to Sonic yet, technically, in our quest. We haven't quite got there yet. But if you imagine, like we're like working through the 90s, obviously Sonic's 91-ish, and Game Gear's just getting started, and then you can whack Sonic on a Game Gear in 91, 92. That's going to help it a lot. The problem when you play Sonic on a Game Gear is because you haven't got that screen resolution, you haven't got the real estate to see where Sonic's going, which is that's the main problem I have with Game Gear games. I just don't feel they customize the games to the Game Gear. I think Game Gear got a lot of ports from Master System games, and they never got the dedicated games like Game Boy got.
That is true, and we'll see that. I mean, there are some there are some Game Gear exclusive games, mostly puzzle stuff that I've gotten to thus far.
So many puzzle games.
Yeah. But one thing I did want to, we'll talk more about the Game Gear as a whole in a second, but one thing I did want to bring up that I mentioned last episode.
You did.
Is that so when we started the Master System, I was very excited. You were very excited. We're like, finally, we're getting away from SG. We're going into a bit more complicated games. And I don't know about you, but I was disappointed with the Master System for the most part. There were some obvious standouts, but in general, I was like, wow, the Master System kind of blows. Sorry, guys. Sorry, Sega fans. It just didn't grow up with it.
It does.
Yeah, and what I've been fascinated by is the quality of decent games to crap on Game Gear is higher than I thought. Now, I like puzzle games. I like well-made puzzle games. So, you would think that, okay, Tetris, obviously, Sega's got columns, that's their Tetris type game. But I'm not talking about the falling block puzzle games. I'm talking about like kind of puzzle platformer, puzzle arcade type games.
All right.
They're very simple, and they don't really take advantage of the Game Gear's hardware even. But they're really fun to play still, like 30 years later. And I've been surprised at the quality of some of these. And we'll get to them, in a while. But it's... So I guess my big thing I was going to say is, even though the Game Gear has a lot of the same elements of the Master System, I think Sega or whoever was making games for the hardware, with the exception of the Master System ports, because I do agree, I think those didn't get the same quality and attention that they deserved. However, games made for the Game Gear work. They just work well. I can't... It's just surprised me a lot as I've been... Mostly I'm in Mega Drive right now, or Genesis, and Game Gear. Those are the two that I'm really focusing on right now. And I like Game Gear games as much as I like Mega Drive games, or more, most of the time. It's weird. And if you would have told me that, when I started doing Game Gear, I would have been like, nope, that's not going to happen.
Yeah.
But maybe it's just where I'm at in life. I don't know. I just like slow-paced puzzle games more now. I don't know. But it's, the Game Gear... Yeah, I think what it set out to do, it didn't really do very well. Like when it was brand new, right? When it was brand new, it was trying to compete with the Game Boy. It was this, again, more of a premier product, color screen, definitely more power within it. But it didn't really have that killer app. It never had a killer app. I mean, I guess you could call it Sonic was, maybe.
Yeah, but it didn't have the killer app straight away. The problem, wasn't it? It was like it didn't have its Tetris. Yeah.
No, it didn't.
And it's like, I'm going to play 100. I believe it was £100 English when it came out. I'm not paying £100 to play columns. I'm just not doing it.
No, it's not going to happen.
No.
Terrible.
I don't remember it being £100. I remember it being a lot more.
It was $149.99 over here.
I swear it was $150 over here. I mean, I might be remembering wrong, but I remember it being pretty expensive throughout its life. I don't remember it ever being cheap either. I didn't see many of them either. Everybody had a Game Boy, but Game Gear was this like, oh wow, you must be a rich kid if you got a Game Boy. A Game Gear. You must be.
Most kids that owned Game Boys, they didn't just have Game Boys.
That's
was like
true.
one.
Yeah.
It was like one of their things. So you're right. They unlike my cousin who, what did he have? He had a Genesis. But see, this is the crazy thing. He paid for all of these things. He saved up his money. I don't even know where he got the money doing odd jobs. I guess he wasn't 16 yet, so he wasn't like working proper. Wow. So he must have just done a lot of chores. But he had a Genesis, a Game Boy, and a Game Gear.
Wow. You just love games.
He did. Yes, he did. Yeah.
One of this, it amazes me that the portable side of gaming, not so much now, like in the later 2000s portable systems, but the early portable systems got a lot of accessories.
They did.
A lot of add-ons, and people bought them as well.
They did.
Which is the more like Game Boy crappy. I'm trying to think of the right word.
Those like light box things.
Yeah, light box, like illuminate your screen and magnify. There we go. Magnify your screens, which is hilarious because you're putting a bit of plastic on top of your screen, which is the same size as your screen. Like, how much bigger do you think it's going to be, guys? But that'll
be $40.
Yeah. They sold in the millions, and then obviously you have the connection cable, the link cable, which I didn't see really in the wild until Pokemon came along. I think they were really lucky they had it for when Pokemon came along.
Oh yeah.
And then there was obviously the Game Boy camera, which was very prolific. Surprising.
Yeah, the camera and the printer.
And the printer. God, the printer. It had a printer, people. Yeah, what a printer. Anyway, printer. Game Gear had its share of accessories too, and we've already talked about the battery pack, which was just pretty much essential. It also had an official AC cable as well, which was also essential because, you know, unless you want to be trolling down to the 7-Eleven every 4 hours to get a pack of double A's, it was much cheaper just to buy the AC adapter and go, okay, what I'm going to do with my Game Gear is instead of playing it on the go, I'm going to go somewhere and play it there. You know, that's kind of how the Game Gear worked in my head.
Yeah.
So it wasn't a portable system. It was a system that was portable. There's a difference. Trust me. Okay.
Yeah.
We also had, is this right? A Master Gear converter. What is that? Is that a Master System converter for your Game Gear?
Yeah.
Wow.
So it's like...
That can't have worked well.
It's like that. I don't know what memes were popular in the UK in the mid 2000s, but it's like that exhibit meme where it's like, I might butcher this, but it's like, hey dude, did you pimp my ride when you pimp my ride? Or it's like it's like a double or a triple.
Yeah. Okay.
And it's like that's what this is. It's like you play your Master System on your Game Gear, which is essentially a Master System. It's like it's weird. It's like the power base converter for the Game Gear, and so
surely that's like getting on Tower of Power territory with the amount of stuff that's sticking out the top of your Game Gear, is it not?
I agree. Yeah. What was the best? Okay, so this is the best peripheral to me. It's the TV tuner.
Wow.
It allows you to get back in the day when there wasn't digital TV.
Analog TV. Yeah.
Analog TV.
The best TV.
You got your rabbit ears, and so the TV tuner has like a little antenna, and you plug it back into your Game Gear, and you can watch, basic network television from your Game Gear. And it cost over $100 when it came out.
Oh wow!
But I bet it sold pretty decent, because portable TV was still a novelty back then.
Yeah.
So I bet it sold halfway decent.
Just hopefully your show you was watching wasn't more than 90 minutes long, because the batteries weren't going to last that long.
Right. I wonder if the batteries...
They must have drained twice as fast. They've got to be.
Yeah, that's what I would...
receiver, it's going to be sucking juice like...
Right, that's what I would think too. Oh my gosh.
What is a... where is the word for it? What is a super wide gear?
I believe it is like the magnifying glasses we were talking about earlier.
Okay.
I don't have a picture of it here, but
that would make
that's
sense.
What it's.
Yes.
Yeah.
Sense.
Yeah.
See, you don't get things like that anymore. What accessories have you got for your PS5? Well, I got some headphones. There you go.
I got an SSD.
Yeah. There you go. I haven't got something that can pick up channels from another country. No.
All this stuff is just so readily available now that it's
It's hard to get into people like younger generations. Like the novelty of having a screen in your hand was just
right.
Like, wow.
Yeah.
You know, houses had a TV, and you know if you were doing
Right.
all right, you buy a new TV for the main room, and then maybe your mum and dad would keep the old one, and you could have it. It was probably black and white. Like my first TV was black and white.
Right.
I could tune a Super Nintendo into it. It didn't look great, but it worked. And it was in my room away from everybody else, so I liked it.
There you go.
And it was like 10 inches wide. And I'm sure it's going to give me cancer later in life. But and it hummed. You know, electronics are heartwarming when they hum. It's like it's talking to you. But I love you. Leave me on. I won't explode. I promise. And then if I break, guess what you can do? You can hit me, and I will magically burst into life again, and I will start working.
That's right.
And they did
Tube
that.
TVs, man. Yeah.
Yeah. Went off.
Crazy.
And you could kill someone with them. They were that heavy. They were great.
Even the small ones were so heavy.
It's like a solid bit of 12-inch glass. Of course, it's going to be heavy.
I have like I don't know if it's 18 or 21-inch tube TV.
Yeah.
That thing is freaking heavy. It's massive.
When they got like early 2000s, when they got them 32-inch Bravia Sonys, which are like generally regarded as the best gaming TVs.
Right.
They are so heavy.
Yeah.
So heavy. I had one at the old place, and it was a 3-man lift. That thing was heavy. I don't know what they put in them. Rocks, I think. They were crazy. Anyway, 90s technology. Yeah, this was kind of a big deal. Was the screen, it being colour? I mean, it's a flat screen that's colour. It's because portable TVs were a thing, but they were all tubes and they were like weirdly long. I don't remember seeing screens like this for a long time after.
Right. Well, man, when was the Game Boy Color? Like 99, 98, 99?
Yeah, but it wasn't backlit.
That's true. That's a good point. Yeah.
Yeah.
But Sega liked to be on the cutting edge, as we will see with like Sega CD and stuff. They like to be. They just, I don't know. They just like that stuff. I mean, even the Mega Drive, it released in late '88 in Japan.
That's nuts.
It's old tech by even by '93. It's old.
Really old, yeah.
Yeah.
Especially how tech used to move back then. Like 12 months was like ancient.
Right.
So I think maybe now we should just have a quick gloss over of the first 3 games. And the first game we need to talk about is what was regarded as, it won't be a long conversation, I promise you, was the pack-in. Now, Game Boy famously packed in Tetris. You know, it was purchased, stolen, whatever you want to call from the Russians, whatever it was, but they got it. And it helped a lot to sell Game Boys. I personally think it only helps because the Game Boy was so cheap, and it was kind of like filling. Well, I don't know, because your gas is pretty cheap, but it was kind of like you could buy a Game Boy for about as much as you could fill your car with gas. You know, they weren't expensive, and the fact that it came with a cool puzzle game that was not just good, maybe one of the greatest games ever made.
Right.
It kind of helped, you know, just a little bit. And then we have columns. For the Game Gear. As you probably heard over the past 3 or 4 episodes of Sega Does, columns isn't really my jam. And now I could play it on the Game Gear if I really wanted to. Is there much to say about the Game Gear version of columns, Dylan? Really?
Nothing other than if you like columns and you like portable gaming,
Well, that's just written me off, hasn't it? Twice.
Honestly, columns works best on the Game Gear, I think.
Oh, really?
Well, in the sense that, to me, these types of games just go really well on handheld systems. Especially back in like 1990, 1991. I mean, thankfully, when we were kids, we weren't expecting to play Super Mario World or even Super Mario 3 level quality of games on the Game Boy. Or, we weren't expecting that. We knew Super Mario Land is a kind of a watered down version of the Mario games that we were getting. So it's not like today, or even with the 3DS or DS, where it's like, no, these are fully fledged proper games, on these handhelds. So to me, something like Columns just works better. I'm not buying a Genesis to play Columns. That's stupid. That's dumb. But I might buy a Game Gear, and especially if Columns comes with it, it's like, oh, it's a puzzle game. Neat. It's like, there it is. It's there. So I still don't like Columns. I don't care if it's on the Game Gear, the Master System. I don't care where it is. I don't like it. But it's fine. It works well on Game Gear.
So how am I right in thinking there were 3 launch games?
Correct. 3 launch games. Okay. In Japan.
Yeah. So the next one I've got on the list is Pengo.
Pengo?
What's Pengo? I will admit I have not played Pengo. So what is Pengo?
It is it's actually, and I didn't realize this until I played the game. It's a port of an early 80s Sega arcade game.
Ooh.
Where you control a penguin. Obviously, they love their penguins.
Oh, it's a penguin game. Dylan loves it. Dylan likes his penguin.
No, I don't. I didn't really care for this one.
Oh, no?
I didn't. You essentially just push ice blocks into blobs. You have to clear out the enemies from the ice maze, and that's it. It's really simple and generic, and I felt like even for a launch game, it just felt very quick. It's is very, I don't know. It's fine. Again, it's fine.
It'll be the novelty of, look, it's in colour, will be like...
Exactly.
It's kind of like when the Game Boy Advance came out. It's like, oh, look, it's 16-bit in your hands. It doesn't matter if you can't see it. Look, it's 16-bit.
Right.
It'll be there. The last game for launch in Japan...
The best game for launch, by
the
way.
best game for launch, okay, is Super Monaco GP.
Sam's favorite.
Yeah.
Sam's favorite.
Unlike the Master System version, this one actually works. Now, explain why this one works, Dylan, because I think I've done my Monaco GP bit for the duration of my life. This is a little bit different. It's not just a straight slam bam port.
No, for some reason it moves faster and it controls better.
Yeah. Well, it controls. There you go.
It controls. Period. And not only that, you don't have that split screen that the Master System was plagued with, which I think is why it moves so much better.
So do I.
So it makes you wonder, why didn't they just do this on the Master System? Is it the technical limitations of the console?
I just think they really... Here we go, we're talking about it again. I really wanted a 2-player racing game for the Master System. Yeah. It's just like the 2-player thing was... we have to add value to this absolutely crappy game. How do we do it? Oh, you can play it with a friend. But you can't because it doesn't work. But
right.
Yeah... I really hate it. That was the thing for me when I loaded this up. I was like, how are they going to do this? How are they going to split screen this? Because I assumed it was a straight port, but it isn't.
Right.
And it works in a way. I still don't think it's fantastic, if I'm honest with you. But yeah, an improvement on one of the worst games ever made is something.
Yeah, I mean, it's again, like I mentioned I think it was the last episode, it's kind of staggering how much better the game is. Like, it's not like going to win any awards or anything, but it is.
It is better.
It's so much better, and it's the best of the launch lineup, which isn't saying much, but it is. It is better.
It's there.
I would like to read, before we close, I would like to read some comments on the Sega Game Gear article.
Ooh, okay.
Just to see what other people their experiences with the Game Gear.
Cool.
Flux says, good stuff. I actually bought a Game Gear about a year ago. It's definitely not a year ago now, but at the time. And after repairing the capacitor issues, I was actually pretty surprised by how much I liked it. While tethered to the AC plug, of course.
Yeah.
Soot says, the Game Gear is the last console I picked up. It never interested me back in the day. After the almost now obligatory capacitor replacement surgery, I admit to being pleasantly surprised. The screen, while not up to modern handheld standards, better than expected. Got myself some rechargeable batteries, and I am having fun with it.
Rechargeable batteries not a thing back in 1990.
No. Let's do Sean. We haven't done Sean in a while.
We haven't, actually.
Being a huge Sega fan, even I never bought a Game Gear.
Whoa.
I suppose it did well enough, but nobody could compete in that space with Nintendo. I think the hardware was fine, but the battery life is atrocious compared to Game Boy, plus the higher price. You could play Master System on your Genesis, so I just didn't see the appeal. His first handheld was a GBA, actually.
Wow.
Unless you want to count the Sega Nomad, which...
Oh, that's just so Sean, isn't it?
That he has a Nomad?
I didn't get a Game Gear, but I got a Nomad. Of course you did. That's perfect.
I think what's great is that when Sega, in 1995, when Sega was floundering, they were floundering in 95, they're like, you know what? Let's put out a portable Genesis. So we're supporting 6 things, and two of them are handhelds, sort of. One is sort of a handheld. I love, man, Sega.
When we get to that period, dude, it's gonna be
so
hilarious.
Bonkers. Yeah, so bonkers. I'm excited.
It's kind of crazy when you think they literally released the Genesis in your hand, and like
it's incredible.
And
really cool.
if it was a bit bulky, but it wasn't like a Lynx or anything. It was you could play it, and you could see. Maybe Nintendo stole this because you could plug it into a TV.
You could,
like a Switch, and you could plug controllers into it, if I'm remembering right.
Yeah,
as well.
That's right.
And it's like, hang on, they actually got this really right, but nobody wanted one because Genesis was done. They wanted 3D.
Yeah,
it's weird.
Well, and if you thought the battery life on the Game Gear was bad, the Nomad was I think 1 to 2 hours for 6 batteries or something. I'm probably getting that wrong, but it was really bad because I know my cousin that I mentioned earlier, he was looking into it, and he was just like, no, there's no reason to get this. Yeah,
I can't afford the upkeep.
Right.
It's like buying a really nice car and realizing it goes through tires like everything else.
Oh my gosh.
Oh dear.
Yeah.
So, what did the Game Gear sell? The Game Gear sold 11 million units, which is, it's a few, but it's not 118 million, which is what the Game Boy sold. So, in terms of success, it was a tenth of a Game Boy.
Yeah. And, I mean, this would go throughout history. I mean, the DS, which was mocked upon the PSP's arrival.
Oh yeah,
I remember the DS was just, at least in the States, people just.
I remember stories of like reviewers in magazines and websites refusing to even pick up Nintendo DSs and review them because it was just seen as the inferior thing instantly. Now it took about a year for that to all of a sudden like disappear. But there was a good chunk of time where the DS was literally a laughing stock of the game world. It was crazy.
And then it, sold 150 million units, and the PSP did really well still. But
it did, actually.
Yeah.
Yeah.
It's Nintendo just always knew what to do in the handheld space, pretty much. Mm-hmm. And everybody else tried, but they couldn't do it.
No.
And the Game Gear is a weird footnote now in history. Like, at the time, I remember it being, there were tons of ads for it. There was
they
just like anything. I mean, it's really hard to imagine now. But like Sega was everywhere in the 90s. They were everywhere.
They were.
It's like Sony today. They were just
Well,
their
I'd say
marketing.
they were even more than that though, because not only were they like your technical and entertainment side of thing. For me,
Right.
I mean, I've told this story before. Sonic, before he was a game character, because obviously I never really had him as a game on a game console. He was
Right.
he was a cultural icon. He was in my cereal. He was in my
Right.
lunchbox for school. He was a comic. He was on TV. He was just. It was so crazy how instant the Switch was that everybody in the world, if you'd said Sonic the Hedgehog, they knew what you were talking about, and it was literally within a year.
Yeah.
It was. I'd love to really analyze how that happened, because he instantly became a Mickey Mouse-esque icon. Instantly. I would say probably even quicker than Mario did.
Oh, absolutely. Mario took a little bit of time, but Sonic was like you say,
it was just
almost
instant. It was crazy.
I would say it took about a year
Yeah.
for Sonic to properly dominate, because the first Sonic was obviously really huge and sold a ton of Genesis, Mega Drives, whatever. Genesis. But when Sonic 2 came out in 92, it was done. Like,
Yeah.
Sonic's cultural domination was assured.
It was complete.
And then by 93, you had the comics, you had all the merchandise, you had 2 cartoon shows running at the same time, and they were both completely different. I don't mind sharing this, because I don't know if I'm ever going to do it on the website, but I actually had an idea for kind of a sidebar on Sega Does called Supersonic Segway, and it's essentially chronicling kind of what we're talking about now, like
We're gonna watch all
chronicling
the Sonic episodes.
yeah, like and talking about each one, and like looking back, because I think all the comics are online, and like reading the comics and just looking at like kind of like what you say, like how did this happen? You know, like within a year, Sonic was bigger than Mario. Yeah, there's no doubt. Sonic was bigger than Mario for about, I would say, what would you say, like 2 to 3 years, maybe?
I would
Something
say
like that.
until he was
Until Mario 64.
Yeah, I was
think.
going to say that. I mean, he was dead before then, bless him, the little blue guy. But we didn't know it.
Right.
If you know what I mean.
Exactly.
Like,
Yeah.
he wasn't coming back, but we still had hope.
We played Sonic 3D Blast. We're like, this could be okay.
It's
or
good. Look,
it's-
look.
Yeah, look.
No, flicky. Anyway, right. I think we've talked enough Game Gear. So,
I agree.
from now on in the Sega Does Patreon, we are talking about Master System, Genesis, and Game Gear games. So to tune in for that, get yourself over to Sega Does, get commenting on everything, share this, review it. We don't ask a lot, but we are today. So if you like this show, review it, give it to your friends, tell them about it, and we will see you next time. Sega Dylan.
Sega.
See ya.